Thank you so much. Thank you to Surrey Virtual Schools. Thank you to Amwen for inviting me along today. I'm really delighted to be here with you, particularly because Surrey was my local authority when I was growing up in care. So it does feel a little bit like I'm coming home. I don't live in Surrey anymore, but it's really lovely to be able to speak to you all today. So I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about myself. Um, my name, as I said, my name's Kirsty. As Amwen said, I'm a care leaver. I was taken into care at the age of 2, and I stayed in the care system until I was 23. So a little bit longer than usual because I was still at university at 23. While I was in care, I had one really short-term foster placement for about 6 months before I moved on to a second longer term foster placement, and I stayed in that second placement until I aged out at 23. And then I had a staying put arrangement, and I lived in supported lodgings in the same placement. So that second foster family that I lived with is really I consider them to be my family, my mum and my dad and my siblings, etc. So while I was in care, I went on to university to study creative writing. I ended up doing a PhD at Brunel University London. As Amwen said, my thesis title was Representations of Care Experienced Children in Contemporary British Fiction. And my research involved using examples of care experience from fiction and analysing them for how they represented looked after children and care leavers. So, of course, I've spent a very, very long time deep into the Tracy Beaker discourse, and whether Tracy Beaker helps or harms representation, I think the jury is still out amongst a lot of care leavers and care experienced people on that question. So in fact, after I finished my PhD, I did some consultation work on the Beaker Girls, which is the latest book in the Jacqueline Wilson series. It came out a couple of years ago. And I also worked on consultation with a group of care leavers for the TV reboot, My Mum Tracy Beaker, which I believe came out on the CBBC in February of this year. And then on top of that, I sit on a media representation panel with the charity Who Cares Scotland. We advise filmmakers, authors, publishing houses on representation. I do sensitivity reads sometimes for children's books as well. And I've spoken at academic conferences, local authority councils, events like this one, charities on this issue of representation. And I've also written for the Telegraph and the Guardian on the same issue. I'm the author of a novel, Careless. There it is. That came out in May this year. It's a work of fiction which it follows a 15-year-old girl growing up in the care system, and it's loosely based on my own experiences of care. In writing this book, I wanted to tackle some of the stereotypes which came up again and again in relation to care experienced people. So really, as you can see, I'm a big nerd for care experience representation, which I appreciate it's a bit niche, but I really want to explain to you today why this is so important to me and why I think as practitioners it should be important to you, which I'm sure it already is. So first of all, I want to demonstrate this using a video. This is something that I was shown, first of all, by Kenny Murray at Who Cares Scotland. So I hope this works, first of all. So what I would like you to do is I'm going to play the video, and if you could either just unmute yourself if you feel comfortable or just pop into the chat what you think you can see in this video. So just anything that comes into your head. I hope that's working. Let me know if it's not. What did you see in the video? Any comments coming through? There's a few there already. There wasn't meant to be sound, Will, so that's okay. Someone says it makes me think of a house and hiding, bullying, no escape. It makes me feel sad, anger. Looks like a person letting two people in and out. Difficult relationships at home. The circle is the odd one out. Abuse, never belonging, rejection, odd one out, lots of change. Is it about fitting in? Persistence of trying to get in, trying to let yourself fit in, breaking out of a difficult relationship. So loads and loads and loads of really good ones there. I'll just give it 30 seconds or so if anyone else wants to chime in with their thoughts. Oh, we've got more. Trying to belong, inclusion and exclusion, not fitting in, door opening and closing, force, inequality, bullying and intimidation, feeling different, not fitting in, trying to fit in. Made me think of a foster home and a child or young person being in and out of the home physically and emotionally, trying to escape the box they've been put in. Round peg, square hole analogy, doors opening and shutting, letting people in and trying to break free, support with that at times. Challenging being defined. Wow, there's so many. Thank you so much. That's brilliant. It's always a bit worrying when you do something like that and ask for people to respond. It's like you never know what you're going to get or if anyone's ever even going to respond to you at all. So thank you so much for engaging with that. So it seems like there's loads and loads of different ideas about what that video could possibly be showing. They're all really, really good ideas. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, none of them are correct. The person that made this video made a video of some shapes. That's all it is. What we're looking at here is just some shapes moving around a screen, right? That's all it is. We all take different meanings from this, as we can see just from everyone's different interpretations. We ascribe context, we tell a story. Our brains can't help doing this. We have to ascribe meanings to things. And there's lots and lots of different things, different contextual clues that would inform the story that we are all telling about these shapes moving around the screen. I imagine the biggest one is the context of the fact that we're all at this conference and the fact that you know that I'm about to deliver you a keynote on labelling, language and representation. But there might be other things informing that story we're telling about the shapes, right? So, you know, things like your own experiences, your upbringing, your class, your age, your gender, your ethnicity. Maybe it's something you saw on the news this morning. Maybe it's whether or not you had any breakfast today and what sort of mood that's put you in for the rest of the day. All of these factors are things that are helping your brain to develop context, to fill in the gaps, if you like, to tell the story of these shapes. So let's talk a little bit about filling in the gaps. How do we fill in the gaps about children in care and care leavers? So I've put a few different words up here to describe care experienced people, terminology that's commonly used. So I did a little bit of looking around the internet, different charities, different local authorities and their glossaries that they've got. I want you to just quickly glance over this list and let yourself feel your brain's honest response to each of these words. Without realizing that we're doing it, we see these words and we ascribe different meanings to them. Foster child, looked after child, care experienced person, care kid, foster kid, service user, LAC, and so on and so forth. We look at each one of these words and phrases and immediately our synapses are firing off different responses, making connections, making assumptions about the people these words are describing. And again, our brains can't help but do this. It's how we ascribe meaning to the world, how we build our worldview, but overly relying on these assumptions also breeds prejudice. So let me tell you a little bit about how it works. We begin with statistics. These are the irrefutable facts of what it's like to be a care experienced person. I want to talk about statistics through the lens of poor outcomes, which I'm sure this is language that everyone here is familiar with. The idea of poor outcomes stems from psychiatric and sociological research, which is done by two researchers called Dragan and Gulliford, into life trajectories. It's a set of life outcomes achieved in adulthood, which indicates low quality of life in the academic sense, or quote unquote social failure. And basically, people who fall into these behaviours and psychological patterns have somehow failed at life, and consequently their quality of life is compromised. Individuals who achieve poor outcomes, I'm talking about this in terms of what Dragan and Gulliford say, are excluded from the mainstream. And there's also a suggestion in Dragan and Gulliford's research that these outcomes are achieved due to a series of inputs in early life which compromise a child's development. So how do we see poor outcomes manifest in foster children? Well, care experienced children are more likely to exhibit aggressive behaviour, at increased risk of impaired adult emotional and behavioural outcomes, including but not limited to substance abuse problems, criminal convictions and depression, more likely to report mental health problems in later life. Again, this is not me saying this, this is the statistics saying this. I'll share another quick example with you. This is from a 2016 report from the Department of Education quoted in iNews. 40% of care leavers aged 19 to 21 are also not in education, training or employment, compared to 14% of all 19 to 21-year-olds. Care leavers are less likely to be in higher education. This according to a 2016 report from the Centre of Social Justice, with only 6% of them accessing higher education, compared to 40% of the general population. Now, we know for a fact that this is wrong. We know for a fact because lots and lots of care experienced people go on to higher education in later life as mature students, and they don't disclose their care leaver status. So we know here that even the statistics that are being delivered to us by academics, by government bodies, are not irrefutable. Having said that, we're starting to see very clearly here a picture that is beginning to build up around care experienced people. We're seeing a number of tropes and assumptions beginning to emerge. So based on all of the information I've just shared with you over just those last two slides, here are some of the words and phrases that are jumping out from those reports. So we've got aggressive, addiction, mental illness, crime, etc. Without context, the statistics that we are being delivered as the general public, as practitioners, as care experienced people, they really become very damaging of what and deliver a damaged understanding of what care experienced people can do, who they are, what they can achieve, and how we tell their stories. These are all things we've seen and heard before about care experienced young people, right? You know, I'm sure everyone here doesn't agree with them, but you know, we're all aware of the stigma attached to the care experience. And when I say we, I'm talking about the general public here. We take these facts and associated assumptions almost as a received wisdom, even when they're inaccurate, and we know that some of these are inaccurate. We understand them to be true, and then we see things like this, which only serves to enforce what the data is already telling us. Anger mounts as Blackpool Children's Home plans set to go before council. So this is from August 2020. 114 residents signed a petition to stop a children's home coming to their street. The children's home would be for two children, just two children. From the article, quote, "It's feared the children are likely to be among the most troubled who have not found places in foster care, prompting concerns for antisocial behaviour." The residents also cited concerns about the parking in the area for this children's home for just two children. Here's another one for you. Neighbours' concerns over children's home plan in house on Wolverhampton Street. This one is from January 2021. This is a quote from the article. People living nearby have told the council they fear the move could lead to crime, antisocial behaviour, disturbances and general anxiety for neighbours, some of whom are vulnerable. Other concerns include the loss of privacy, conflict between the occupants and children living at neighbouring properties, an increase in traffic and insufficient parking space. Again, with the parking space, it's very strange to me about this parking space thing. The children's home was also proposed to be for 2 children, by the way. Yes, moving on. Here's one more. Children's care home approved for Walsall despite petition in protest. This one is from February 2019, from the article. There's going to be more crime in the area. The other residential homes nearby are older people, so they are quite docile. There's no noise from them. Another objector added, I live next to the property in question. We're concerned that the proposal will affect our daily lives. So here it's like they're not really saying anything. They're not saying, you know, we're worried that these kids are going to commit crimes. We're worried about antisocial behaviour. But they're saying, oh, the neighbours are older, they're quiet, they're docile. We're worried the proposal will affect our daily lives, which does it, again, it doesn't really say anything at all, does it? But I think when you kind of read between the lines a little bit, it's saying quite a lot. It seems like every other week there's a new children's home protest in regional or local news. The main concerns always seem to be about the antisocial behaviour, the crime, the noise disturbances, and of course, no parking spaces, God forbid. What exactly is it? What is it that drives people to campaign against children living in their communities? These are vulnerable, traumatised children. They're just children. I really can't understand it. It works the other way too. I want you to bear with me on this one. Obviously, Ian Brady did very, very terrible things and, you know, should be in prison for those things. So I'm coming out of the left field a little bit, but I want you to run with me. This is a charming headline from 2017 about Ian Brady, who, of course, was one of the perpetrators of the Moors murders. There was a little bit of interest generated in 2017 because new photographs of Ian Brady from his childhood had been discovered, and much of that, this article, which I think was in the Daily Mail, of course, it was talking about these photos, talking about details of Ian Brady's childhood. And of course, there was an emphasis on the fact that Ian Brady grew up in foster care. So let's just read the headline here. Ian Brady's childhood in Glasgow gave early signs of his descent into depravity. I think that it's rational and it's part of our human nature to look to explanations for things that we don't understand. And very frequently, when there's a particularly horrendous high profile case in the news, and of course Ian Brady is a really extreme example of this, but I could give you lots and lots of other examples. Journalists do this thing where they scramble to dig up background information about whoever it is that's committed this crime, and very, very often they will look into that person's childhood, their history, to try and land on something which might explain why someone did what they did. And the result is that often, if there is a high profile case, in terms of background, there's often an overemphasis on a person's care experience, if there is any at all. I just want to share with you one more example here. I'm really hammering this point home, but I hope you appreciate what I'm trying to do. So this is another one that gets my back up in terms of the language. Looks quite innocuous when you first look at it. I just want you to look at the phrasing of these two headlines. So on the left, we've got families fight plans to turn Stoke-on-Trent terrace into children's home. And on the right, families fail in bid to stop children's home opening. I want you to notice how the word family is positioned in opposition to the word children's home. It kind of creates this us versus them mentality, doesn't it? And I think, again, on the face of it, this is something that's very innocuous, but I just want to show you this is a really good example of how language is working to kind of other children in care. So we've got this never-ending cycle going on here. The news media tells us that care experienced people are aggressive, they're antisocial, they're disruptive, and they are criminals. So the public don't want to live near new children's homes. You know, they start petitions, they stage protests, they put placards out, you know, on their driveways, all that kind of stuff that we all know about. And then newspapers report on these protests, and they cite the residents' concerns, and they reinforce all of those same negative stereotypes again and again and again, and rinse and repeat. So this is one way of looking at it, but maybe we need to give people a little bit more credit here, right? People don't believe everything they read in newspapers. I definitely don't, you know, not recently. So what else is it that is informing these, what we're calling negative public perceptions of looked after children? What is it? So, of course, I am talking about entertainment media, and particularly books, film, and TV. This is my bread and butter. This is what my thesis was on. But I think it's really important to have that context of news media and statistics as a starting point, because I think that's where we lead to when we get these sorts of characters. But before I start talking about this, I just want to return to poor outcomes very quickly, which is what I talked about at the start of this presentation. So, as I said, this term poor outcomes, it's been used by Dragan and Gulliford. They're two sociologists who researched later life trajectories on care leavers. Here's how they define poor outcomes here. I think there's, as I've said, there's a stigma that follows children around, children in care through their lives. And it's a stigma that's informed by these statistics and these newspaper articles and hearsay. It's this idea that children in care are doomed to fail. It's also the reason that we have so many people from care going into university in later life and not disclosing their care experience background because they don't want to be associated with that label. Doomed to fail, that's anecdotally that we're all going to end up in prison, on drugs, on benefits, single mothers, and so on. This is something I experienced myself growing up in care, as did many of my peers who also grew up in care. As a researcher and as a care leaver, I'm looking critically at the narratives of care that dominate popular culture. That's TV, film, comic, biography, and fiction, but particularly fiction. And I'm seeing it's not just me who had this experience of growing up in care and being expected to achieve quote unquote poor outcomes in later life. All of my favourite fictional characters who experience some form of care also have this mantle thrust upon them that they're doomed to fail. Popular culture tells us that foster children are difficult, foster children are naughty, foster children are lacking in some way that children living with biological parents are not. And it's this missing puzzle piece that predetermines foster children's predisposition for failure. It's evident across the children's character. It's the children's canon. It's really prevalent in children's books. Again, I think it's so important that we're talking about children's books here, because this is where children first understand themselves in literature. That's where they first see themselves reflected back. That's where they see how society understands them. So it's worth noting now that when we examine fiction through this sort of critical lens, as I'm doing here, we have to work on this premise that that fiction is written either as a social commentary or as reflective of what is happening around us in society. When thinking of fiction in this way, what writers choose to represent, what they choose to say about children in care, becomes all the more charged and meaningful. So let's look at that latter interpretation first, that fiction is reflective, that it's holding up a mirror to society. I appreciate that it doesn't seem very relevant to talk about fiction, but I think it is really, really important. If it is the case that fiction is holding a mirror up to society, then we have to understand representations of care experienced children in fiction as a reflection of public perceptions of disrupted childhoods. As we've already discussed, we know for a fact that children in care have a higher likelihood of achieving poor outcomes in later life, even when we disregard the inconsistencies in those statistics. It's still indisputable. So it's not unfounded then to subscribe to this popular stigmatization of children from disrupted care backgrounds as problem children, as it's so empirically clear that looked after children are more likely to develop these problems before, during, and after leaving care. This is a typecasting of children in care as problematic, as destined for poor outcomes. It begins in the child's early life and it leads and continues into adulthood. You know, in very simplistic terms, adults think the worst of children who are without their biological parents. It's reinforced across our most beloved popular culture, our most loved characters in media, again and again and again. So back to Tracy Beaker, my old friend. One example of how care experienced children are othered is through the language of trust. So looked after children are characterised as liars very often. And again, it's reinforced in the story of Tracy Beaker. Tracy willfully, she says this herself, she admits that she tells fairy stories. That's what they're termed by her foster mother. Stop telling fairy stories, Tracy. And Tracy internalizes this as well. That trend continues elsewhere in the canon. Harry Potter, not a character you would typically think of as a care experienced character. He's an orphan. He lives in a boarding school. He lives with his aunt and uncle in kinship care. He's repeatedly characterized as a liar as well in the later books in the series. And worse than that, he's an attention seeker. He's egotistical. Moving over to the US, we have Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events, another children's series. And here we have the distrust of care experienced kids. It's almost like a comic effect. The adults responsible for the Baudelaire children in these books, they fail to believe the children when the children are saying that danger is near, that they're the sort of villain of the story, Count Olaf, is around but in disguise. No one believes the children. So the language of children's fiction, it's reinforcing the trope that looked after children are a threat to social cohesion. You know, again, Tracy Beaker self-characterizes as cheeky, difficult, bossy, language that her social worker Elaine agrees is accurate. Elaine says, "You said it, Tracy." Later in the story of Tracy Beaker, when Tracy tells her social worker about being smacked by her foster mother, her social worker Elaine replies, "Well, sometimes, Tracy, you really do ask for it. Sometimes, Tracy, you really do ask for it." To a child that, by the way, has been taken into care because she's being abused by her stepfather. So, you know, Elaine's language here it's symptomatic of the language of abusers and victim blamers, and it's a trend that is really pervasive. It continues across the children's canon. So just moving on here to some more sociological research, we have Carolyn Gaskell. She identifies, quote, a real need for the care system to provide the consistency and support of aspiration previously lacking within the family. I think that's a really positive way of framing it. Gaskell did a qualitative study. She collected responses from care leavers who were talking about their experience of the care system. And I think really the response here speaks to a lack of trust between looked after children and the figures around them. And I think all of this is informed by what I've just been discussing. There's a lack of support here that might otherwise enable looked after children to achieve aspirational goals. And this comment here is a care experienced person talking about their relationship with their social worker. So she says, they twist what you're saying, they turn it all around, they make out you're lying, that you're making things up. So again, there's this internalized suggestion of care experienced people being liars. So, you know, again, there's a culture, again, it's this culture of low expectations, which is everywhere, even inside the care system. So how do we disentangle the effects these public perceptions of looked after children have on care experienced children's later life outcomes? What's not clear to me is what comes first in this cycle. You know, is it that cultural representations of care experienced children informs the public perceptions, and that in turn conditions the care experienced child that all they deserve is poor outcomes? Or is it that public discourse around the care experienced child is so pejorative that it influences our cultural representation so deeply, and all we see in fiction is the difficult child, and therefore all we see in life is the difficult child? Or is it that the failures of public policy to address the unique problems faced by the care experienced child and the subsequent greater risk of poor outcome in that demographic informs both the public perceptions and the cultural representations? We really have a causality dilemma here. So I just want to return to this for a moment. I want to take a look at this reoccurring trope about lying. We see it in Jacqueline Wilson's characterisation of Tracy Beaker. We see it in Gaskell's interviews with children in care. And I want to tell you a little bit about my own experience with this. From as young as I can remember, I've been called a liar. I was called a liar by my foster parents. I was called a liar by my social workers. I was accused of lying about small things like drawing on the wallpaper with felt tips. I was accused of lying about really big things too, like stealing money, or when I was old enough and I was going out with my friends, where I was going and what I was doing. From a very young age, I was told by the people looking after me that I was a liar. And this label is really something I carried with me through childhood, adolescence, and into adulthood. And I want to say now, before I go on, you know, I was in care in the 90s. So, you know, this is absolutely not an indictment of all the incredible work that people like Surrey Virtual Schools are doing at the moment. I just want to give you this historic context and show you why it's so important that we change some of this language and change some of this stigma. So, care kids are liars. This is something that came up in my own files, which I managed to access for the first time recently. Emotionally, Kirsty seems to be struggling to understand her past and find her place within her peer group. The level of lies is concerning and putting this placement under strain. Kirsty lying is still an issue. We'll talk to redacted person about appropriate support to reduce Kirsty's lying and address her fears. Here's me shortly after I was taken into care. Maybe that little girl is a pathological liar, you know, maybe it is, and maybe she's not. I'm not really here to try and resolve that and have an argument about that. But what I'm suggesting is that this small label, which was first given to me by care professionals and later canonised in my care records, that's a label that's followed me around my whole life. And it's caused me to question how I remembered the events of my childhood. It's caused me to suppress trauma from my childhood. It's caused me to question, you know, whether I remember things correctly. Did that really happen to me? Am I making it up? So here's a few others for you, which I think just gives you the breadth of how this language gets translated and then canonized. So this is redacted is concerned that Kirsty has put her profile on a MySpace webpage and attached a photo. I've discussed with Kirsty the concerns this has generated and the possible vulnerable position she could be placing herself in through doing this. She can be easily influenced. There have been concerns about Kirsty having a number of different male friends, and this needs to be addressed. I was 12 years old when this was written about me. At a review in July, it was suggested that Kirsty is going through some difficulties in understanding herself, has been lying frequently, and more recently has been showing inappropriate sexualized behavior. I was 14 when this was written about me. I just got my first boyfriend. The meeting recognised that Kirsty's early childhood experience has impacted on her ability to attach and are linked to her current behaviour. Where am I? She continues to live within a very busy household where there may not always be time for her to have as much individual attention she may wish or need, which could attribute to her negative behaviours. It's really, really difficult for me to share these snippets with you because really, honestly, they make me feel very deeply ashamed. That feeling of shame is one that's built from all of the different signals I'm being sent as a care experienced person. Signals from the media, from fiction, film and television, from the people in my life, and according to my own records from the professionals who were charged with my care. These are institutions that tell me certain things about myself, that ascribe certain labels to me, and my own records confirm those categorizations. And I do think there is some sensitivity here in the way the writers of these records have reported on the things that happened to me, and the behaviours that I was having. I think there is sensitivity there. I also think that in a way, the people writing these records were trying to protect me a little bit, and they were using vague language in trying to do that. And therefore, there are gaps that need to be filled. Again, we're talking about filling in the gaps. And those gaps are filled in with the imagination of the reader. And ultimately, when the gaps are filled, what my records paint a picture of is someone who is a liar, who's mentally unstable, an attention seeker, desperate to be liked, desperate for attention, and really disturbingly, and this isn't something that I really even remember until I opened up my records for the first time and read these things, someone who is sexually promiscuous or sexually deviant as a 12-year-old girl. Significantly, my own voice, the voice of the subject of these records, is almost entirely absent. I think that's really significant. And again, here's me. I want to know how much of what was written on my records was informed by the likes of Tracy Beaker, the statistics that we see quoted again and again and again, the news media that focuses on the bad kids, the ones that cause antisocial behaviour, noise disturbances, etc., and the ones where things have seemingly to the general public gone terribly wrong. I want to know how much of these records were written with a view that one day I might read them. I'm not sure that was really thought about. I wonder how much the writer considered me as a human being, whether they considered the context of the early childhood abuse I suffered when they wrote, and this is a quote, that my bedwetting was causing issues for my foster parents who were running out of clean sheets. I want to know the answer to these questions, but I don't think I ever will, not because swathes of those documents have been redacted, so even what has been allowed through is incomplete and it's only showing a small fraction of the whole story, and again I need to fill in the gaps. And to be honest, I'm really okay with it now. I've worked through it. I've had lots of therapy. I think all things considered, I've turned out quite well. I'm quite a happy and well-adjusted person. Despite these statistics, despite what the news media has said about me and people like me, despite what my own carers and the professionals looking after me wrote about me in my records, I'm okay now. And I think actually it was so lovely to see Pete and Joe talk before this, because I think, again, there's another example of how we are bucking these stereotypes all the time. So really, what I want everyone here to take away from this is this. The next time you read something or have to write something about one of the children that you work with, the next time you have to fill in a report or file records or complete review forms, I think it's a question of looking a bit deeper at this language. Have a little think about who exactly it is that's going to be reading these documents. Have a think about what an article about a children's home is going to mean to someone who is growing up in that children's home. I don't think that 20 or 25 years ago, the person filling out my files ever thought that I would be the one reading them. I really, really don't. Something that comes up time and again in discussions within the care experience community among care leavers is the idea that the language of love is often very absent from care. So I just want to leave you sorry, one second. I just want to leave you with this quote from Action for Children, who worked with care experienced people to respond to the independent review of children's social care. This is what Action for Children say. We heard that young people want to feel loved and that too often there is a gap of love in the care system. The review needs to make sure all of its recommendations focus on creating a care system that respects the identities of young people and involves them in decisions. And as one young person told us, don't call me a case. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So powerful. And I do hope that, you know, there are 90 people here listening to you speak, and that gives you kind of the strength of the commitment towards this agenda and challenging our assumptions and our language, and the stereotypes that are out there and perpetuated through many different forms. That we really do hear what you're saying, and the pledge this afternoon as well. It follows through very well because there's an opportunity for participants then to say what they will do with this information, this challenge to us. So thank you so much.